In the early morning of July 20th, 964 AD, a Roman nobleman named Giovanni Crescenzi kicked down the door of his own bedroom to find Pope John I themed, the supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church, Christ's representative on earth, naked in bed with his wife. What happened next was so shocking that the Vatican tried to erase it from history for 500 years. The Pope didn't die from poison in the Vatican. He didn't die peacefully in prayer. He died when an enraged husband either beat him to death with his bare hands, threw him out a second-story window while still naked, or according to some accounts, castrated him before delivering the fatal blow. But here's what makes this even more insane. John wasn't just any pope. He was 27 years old, had turned the Vatican into what bishops called a brothel, and had been publicly accused of castrating a cardinal, ordaining a bishop in a stable, toasting to the devil with wine, and invoking pagan gods while gambling with the church's money. This is the story the Catholic Church doesn't want you to know. How the most powerful religious position on earth was once held by a man so depraved, so violent, so absolutely corrupted that his own clergy prayed for his death. A pope who died not as a martyr, but as an adulterer, caught in the ultimate act of betrayal. And the craziest part, he wasn't even the worst pope of his family. His nephew would become Pope John I. His grandnephew would become Pope John XIX. And for nearly a century, one family turned the papacy into their personal playground of murder, sex, and demonic worship. The Counts of Tusculum would produce 9 popes, each using the throne of Saint Peter for their own twisted purposes. Before we dive into this absolutely insane story that the Vatican still refuses to fully acknowledge, if you're fascinated by the dark secrets of history that powerful institutions try to hide, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're exposing the bloodiest truths about historical figures every week. John the Fiend became pope when he was just 18 years old. Not because he was holy, not because he was chosen by God, but because his father, Albert II, was the most powerful warlord in Rome and literally forced the clergy to swear an oath that they would elect his son as pope when the current one died. Think about that. A teenager who had never studied theology, never taken holy orders, wasn't even a priest, suddenly became the most powerful religious figure in Western civilization. His real name wasn't even John, but Octavianus, and he was the first pope to change his name upon election, choosing John because he thought Octavianus sounded too pagan. Though ironically, he would spend his entire papacy acting more pagan than any Roman emperor. The moment he became pope, John turned the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, into something contemporary bishops described as worse than a brothel. He didn't just have mistresses, he had a harem. Pilgrim women coming to Rome for. Blessings were warned not to enter churches alone because the Pope might rape them. He allegedly raped female pilgrims on the altar of St. Peter's Basilica itself. One of his favorite mistresses was his own father's concubine, Stefania. And when she grew too old for his tastes, he moved on to her daughter, then her granddaughter. 3 generations of the same family. The Romans had a saying, "No woman is safe in Rome while John sits on Peter's throne." But sexual depravity was just the beginning of John the Fiend's corruption. When a cardinal criticized him for his behavior, John had the man's eyes gouged out. When a deacon suggested he should pray more, John had him castrated. He personally enjoyed performing these mutilations. One witness described watching the Pope laugh while cutting off a subdine's nose and ears with his own hands. He turned ordination into a joke, ordaining a 10-year-old boy as a bishop because the child amused him, ordaining another bishop in a horse stable as a prank, and selling holy offices to the highest bidder, making men bishops for the right price, regardless of whether they could even read Latin. During Mass, instead of invoking the Trinity, witnesses swore they heard him invoke Jupiter, Venus, and other demons. He would toast to the devil's health with communion wine and turn the altar of Saint Peter's into a gambling table where he would throw dice while invoking pagan gods for luck. The German bishop Ludrand of Cremona, who personally investigated John the Thorn, wrote, "The palace of the Lateran, once a shelter for saints, is now a harlot's brothel. The Pope has made prostitutes of the matrons of Rome." Multiple witnesses testified that John the Fiend regularly performed satanic rituals in the Vatican, conducting black masses where he inverted Christian prayers and allegedly tried to summon demons in the papal crypts. But John the Father's greatest betrayal wasn't sexual or sacrilegious. It was political. In 960 AD, King Baron II of Italy was threatening Rome, and Pope John I, despite being the spiritual leader of Christendom and temporal ruler of the Papal States, was a terrible military commander who spent more time hunting and whoring than defending his territory. In desperation, John the Scene did something unprecedented. He invited Otto Buffer, King of Germany, to come to Italy with his army, and in exchange for military protection, John would crown Otto as Holy Roman Emperor, reviving a title that hadn't existed since Charlemagne. On February 2nd, 962, John Day crowned Otto Affairs as Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. The moment Otto left Rome to fight Baranar, John Theft betrayed him. The Pope started secret negotiations with Baranar's son Adalbert, offering to switch sides, then sent envoys to the Byzantine Empire and even to the Muslim Tsaris, offering to ally with anyone against Otto. Why? Because John realized that having a powerful emperor in Rome meant he couldn't rape, murder, and steal with impunity anymore. When Otto discovered the betrayal, he was furious. He marched back to Rome in 963, and John the Fiend, showing his typical cowardice, fled the city, taking the entire papal treasury with him, while Otto convened a synod at St. Peter's to put the Pope on trial. What emerged from that trial was a list of crimes so extensive that medieval historians thought it must be exaggerated, though modern historians have confirmed most of it was true. The formal charges against Pope John Darth included sacrilege for turning sacred places into brothel, murder for personally killing and mutilating multiple clergy, adultery with numerous married women, incest with his father's concubine and her relatives, blasphemy for invoking pagan gods during Mass, simon for selling church offices, perjury for breaking sacred oaths, and treason for betraying his alliance with Otto. The most shocking charge was devil worship. Multiple witnesses testified about his satanic rituals, pagan shrines, and blood sacrifices. The Senate unanimously voted to depose John the Fiend and elected a new pope, Leo VII. But technically, only a pope can depose a pope. John the Fiend was evil, but he was still legitimately elected, creating a constitutional crisis that would plague the church for centuries. John the Fur, hiding in the countryside with the stolen papal treasury, excommunicated everyone who participated in. The synod declared Otto, Ekix, excommunicated, declared the new pope, Leo VII, an anti-popey, and started raising an army of mercenaries with the church's gold in early 964, when Otto had to leave Rome again to deal with problems in northern Italy. John the Favid marched back into Rome with his mercenary army, and the Romans, terrified of him, opened the gates without resistance. What followed was a reign of terror that made his previous behavior look mild. John held his own counterint where he had Leo VII formally condemned, then started hunting down everyone who had testified against him. He had their eyes gouged out, their tongues cut off, their hands chopped off, and one cardinal who had spoken against him was skinned alive in the public square while John watched and laughed. He ordered that anyone who supported Leo VII would have their property confiscated and their families sold into slavery, turning Rome into a police state where his mercenaries could rape, rob, and murder with impunity. But his focus remained on his sexual appetites. Even while conducting this reign of terror, John couldn't stop his compulsive womanizing. Which brings us to that fateful night of July 20th, 964. The woman John was in bed with when he died was named Stefanetta, the wife of Giovanni Crescendi, a Roman nobleman from one of the city's most powerful families. John had been having an affair with her for months, often in her own marital bed while her husband was away. But on this night, Giovanni came home unexpectedly. Some sources say he was tipped off by a servant. Others say he suspected the affair and planned his revenge carefully. What exactly happened in that bedroom is disputed because the church has tried to suppress different versions for centuries, creating multiple conflicting accounts of the Pope's death. Version 1, the official church version, claims John F died of a stroke while committing adultery, struck down by God for his sins, and that Giovanni never touched him. This is obvious propaganda that even medieval chroniclers didn't believe. Version 2, the violence account says Giovanni burst in, found them in bed, and beat the Pope to death with his bare hands in a rage. With John III dying from blunt force trauma, his skull crushed by the fists of a cuckolded husband. Version 3. The castration account that the church most desperately denies claims Giovanni didn't just kill John the Fiend, but castrated him first, then threw him out the window with the Pope bleeding to death from his genital wounds while lying naked in the street. Medieval historian Lode Pond of Cremona, writing just a few years after the event, said, "One night when John was disporting himself with a certain man's wife outside Rome, the devil dealt him such a violent blow on the temples that he died of the injury within 8 days." Notice the language. The devil dealt him a blow. This was medieval code for saying a cuckolded husband killed him. But Ludeprand couldn't say it directly because he was writing under church patronage. The Annals of Lorsch, written around 970 AD, are more explicit. Pope John was killed by a certain Roman while committing adultery with the man's wife. The most damning evidence is that John's body was never given a papal funeral. He wasn't buried in St. Peter's with the other popes, but was hastily interred in an unmarked grave. Why the hasty burial? Because the body showed clear signs of violence that couldn't be explained by a stroke. Some sources suggest the body was too mutilated to display. Others claimed the castration story was true, and the church couldn't let anyone see a pope who had been emasculated. The immediate aftermath was chaos. With John Thuan dead, Leo VIII tried to reclaim the papacy, but the Romans rejected him as a German puppet and elected their own pope, Benedict V, creating 2 popes who each excommunicated the other. Ottobah had to march on Rome again, exile Benedict thief, and forcibly install Leo EI. This pattern of competing popes, imperial intervention, violence, and corruption would define the papacy for the next century. But the damage John did to the Catholic Church was permanent. He proved that the Pope wasn't chosen by God, but by whoever had. The most swords showed that papal infallibility was a joke when the Pope was invoking Jupiter during Mass, and demonstrated that the highest position in Christendom could be bought, inherited, and corrupted, just like any secular office. The century after John Dupton is called the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy, when his family, the Counts of Tusculum, would control the papal throne for generations, producing multiple popes, each more corrupt than the last. Pope Benedict IX, John Lufton's descendant, would become pope at age 12 and was described as a demon from hell disguised as a priest. He allegedly held orgies in the Vatican and practiced witchcraft. But here's what's truly disturbing about John XIV's story. The church learned nothing from it. Instead of reforming, they covered it up. Medieval chronicles that described John XIV's crimes were hidden in Vatican archives. Historians who wrote about his death were pressured to change their accounts, and the church created the myth of an unbroken line of holy popes stretching back to St. Peter, conveniently forgetting the monsters who wore the papal crown. Even today, if you visit the Vatican, you won't find John Doughty mentioned in the official papal histories. His portrait in the papal gallery is labeled simply John Doughty, 955964, with no other details, and tour guides are instructed not to discuss him. The Catholic Encyclopedia, even in its modern edition, claims John the Flo died of apoplexia stroke and barely mentions any controversies. They've sanitized one of the most shocking murders in history, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that God's representative on earth was a devil, worshipping murderous rapist who died naked in another man's bed. But there's one more twist to this story that almost nobody knows. Giovanni Crescenzi, the man who killed the Pope, wasn't punished, wasn't excommunicated, wasn't executed. In fact, he was quietly rewarded. Within a year of John the Fuina's death, Giovanni became one of the most powerful nobles in Rome, and his family, the Crescenzi, would dominate Roman politics for the next century. Some historians believe Giovanni didn't act alone. They think John XIV's murder was actually a carefully planned assassination disguised as a crime of passion. The Roman nobility, tired of Jay's depravity, may have arranged for Giovanni to discover the affair at exactly the right moment. The fact that Giovanni faced no consequences, that Jay's body was hastily hidden, that a new pope was immediately elected without investigation, it all suggests a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of Roman society. Maybe John Saft wasn't killed by a jealous husband, but was executed by a city that couldn't tolerate him anymore, with his sexual escapades providing the perfect cover for political murder. We'll never know the full truth, because the Vatican has spent 1,000 years burying it. But what we do know is this: the Pope, who claims to be infallible, who claims to speak for God, who claims to hold the keys to heaven and hell, was once a man so evil that his own clergy celebrated when he was murdered in bed with another man's wife. The institution that claims moral authority over billions of people once had a leader who turned the Vatican into a brothel, who castrated his opponent,